Welcome to a new podcast episode. Today, we are talking about nuclear reactors, our favorite topic. Um, in 1970s, the United States started building nuclear power plants at a pace that it's very hard to imagine today. Even utilities were planning huge reactors. The grid was expanding, and nuclear power was actually supposed to supply a massive share of future electricity. Fast forward to today, the conversations look very different. The project can take over a decade, costs are very controversial. And many people, including a lot of young people, still assume that nuclear reactors are something that can take a lot of time to build or simply cannot be built anymore. But is it actually true? Are things changing or are things the same? The economics of infrastructure still makes it harder to make the nuclear reactors now. So to help answer these questions, I'm Hashir and I have Dhruv with me. But to unpack these questions, we have Emmet Penny. Emmet is a well-known voice in the space, runs a Nuclear Barbarian podcast. He's also a writer, historian, and a senior fellow to the Foundation for American Innovation. And he will help us answer these questions about nuclear reactors or where we are at today. Emmet, maybe we can just start with like a bit of an introduction of yourself for the
Sure.
audience, and you can get in and you're interested in nuclear infrastructure history in the first place, so you can go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you for having me. Delighted to be here. Yeah, so I got into nuclear kind of by accident, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. I'm a humanities guy who has stumbled in. I'm a word cell who has stumbled into the world of shape rotators. And, this started a long time ago when ended up working for an organization that was very, very pro-nuclear. I'd sort of been nuke pilled before that by people like Michael Schellenberger and Lee Phillips and a few others, Mark Nelson, Maddie Hilly and Mark Nelson ended up becoming colleagues of mine, and it is sort of impossible to avoid getting nuke pilled if you're going to work with powerhouses like them. They just have all the facts at their disposal. And that was around that whole period stretched between 2017 and 2019 and into 2020. And then after that, I started to do a little bit of advocacy on my own, which was launching the Nuclear Barbarians podcast and Substack. And one of the reasons why I launched that Substack is this was back when being pro-nuclear was very unfashionable. It is amazing and awesome how things have changed since then. But I sort of made a series of bets, which I think some people thought were crazy at the time, because I just thought that the climate narrative for nuclear was going to be fragile because these things tend to go in cycles. It's not that climate change isn't real. It's not that we shouldn't value clean power or anything like that. It's just that I did not think that was a sufficient reason to build nuclear power. And I wanted to launch a publication that advocated for a different sort of view. And that different sort of view will be probably teased out over the course of our conversation. So I'm not going to info dump right now. I was also interested in the history of the utility system and nuclear power. Nuclear is in a very interesting position when you think about it historically, because I can go onto Amazon right now and I can think of several books off the top of my head, frankly, that explain how solar got cheap. In fact, that is the title of one of those books. You know, there is no real substantial, like, one volume history of the US nuclear power sector. You have to buy out of print AEC and NRC histories, and stuff like that, or rip the PDFs off of the DOE's website, like all sorts of stuff. And I wanted to figure out, why did we, stop building these things? What happened? Because it's not enough to say, and this is something we're probably going to get into later on, that, there was a public backlash in the 60s and 70s. That's one small piece of it. And I wanted to piece that together for myself because I had some instincts that we were entering a period of industrial decline and that our grid was under capacity, and that if any growth was going to happen, it was going to look like a catastrophe for the American electricity system. And I think the last 2 years have been like one long victory parade for me in terms of like making calls that ended up being correct, if I don't mind tooting my own horn a little bit. And so, yeah, like that's sort of how I got into nuclear advocacy. It was like, I'm interested in talking to people who are building this. I'm interested in looking into the history of it. I'm looking into the philosophical history of our relationship with technology. And I want to present a different sort of view and introduce people to all sorts of different advocates for nuclear. So I've had everybody on the show from, I just had Carl Perez of Exodus, who's doing modular waste recycling, to people who run remediation firms that clean up nuclear sites, to SMR companies, to advocates who've been on the ground arguing for this stuff for years, all kinds of people. So, yeah, it's been a true pleasure. Luckily, I'm at FAI now, and I get to actually work on nuclear policy, which I can't even believe I'm so lucky as to be able to do that. So, yeah, that's sort of how I ended up here, a little bit of my perspective. And, I hope that helps your listeners understand how I ended up on this Riverside recording session with you.
Definitely helps.
You kind of touched on it, but my next question, could you walk us through the big US nuclear build-out era and the time frame, what the grid looked like before the large interconnections, and why the big baseload plants like nuclear started to make sense?
Yeah, totally. So I think we want to go back to understand what the grid was like around when Admiral Rickover built the Shippingport nuclear power plant, which is the first civilian nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. That was 1957 is when he finished that up. Took him about 2 years, 55 to 57. Before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about utility history. And so electricity is one of those sectors that you never think about when it's going well. So we can often neglect the history of it. Now, what was it like, before the advent of nuclear power? It was a bunch of state regulated monopolies. So there's the Federal Power Commission on top of that. That becomes the DOE later on, DOE and FERC kind of. And that works is basically states through their public utility commission or whatever, like the utilities go to them. They're like, hey, we want this kind of rate of return for these types of investments we're doing, and we'll serve everyone in this territory, no matter who they are or what they want. And the utility commission will vet that ideally and say, no, like you're actually going to get less of a return or whatever. That's how they decided to regulate it in the early part of the 20th century, to just get the simplest version possible. Now, the reason why the utility industry ended up become actually in favor of this sort of regulation is, in a cynical way, it might allow them to capture those regulators and do whatever they want because no one really understood electricity. In fact, most of the engineering departments in America were created by, the initial ones anyway, the utility industry, because managing the electrical system was so demanding that you couldn't just do like practitioner, let's figure this out on the fly. You had to have sort of this academic training up to figure that out. Now, the other reason, which is less cynical, is that it stabilized the financing, right? So we have to remember, around the turn of the century, electricity is still like a cutting edge technology. It has not made it into most places yet. It's sort of like what AI is now, right? Though I would argue electricity is probably right now more important than AI in terms of it makes AI even possible at all. It hadn't yet moved into everyone's homes. It hadn't yet, even started powering most factories. It actually took a long time for it to make it into factories. It took coal shortages in World War I for them to finally capture factories and bring them into the utility system, because factories liked having their own little power plants, so they could cost control. Now, that meant that when you were going to invest in utility, you didn't really know what was going to happen. They had to buy all of this huge, expensive equipment. The capital expenditures were crazy, which meant you really wanted that business to last a long time, because if you outlay all that capital and then it goes bust, like who's on the hook for that? What's going on? This is a crazy environment, especially if you have a lot of competitive rates and a lot of redundant infrastructure. So you're getting like a bunch of smaller power plants when you could actually just have one big one that's way more efficient, right? And drive down rates. And that would be easier to operate and potentially easier to finance, right? So that's why they wanted that state level regulation. Now, once they had that, it allowed them to finance huge plants, right? Because now they had no competition. They had a monopoly. Now, when it came to financing plants, this became what one historian calls the grow and build cycle, where they would say, okay, we've got this size coal plant. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to commission one that is bigger than it. And America's engineers were like the most aggressive, right, in building bigger power plants. Like the Brits and the Germans were way more conservative in the leaps they were going to take and the size of the boiler, et cetera, size of the turbine, so on and so forth. And they would say, okay, we're going to scale this up a little bit. And we're going to do that because once we do that, it will drive down the price of power because we'll have increased supply, which means we get more customers, which means we get more money, which means that we can build yet another big power plant, yet another big boiler attached to that power plant. And boilers just kept getting bigger and bigger and more efficient. And so that was carrying out just real steady. And the engineers there had a learn by doing way of making that happen. Now, you want to keep that in the back of your mind because that's going to be important later. And learn by doing is exactly what it sounds like, right? Building from experience, right, is I think what they called it in-house. They were like, okay, what we're going to do is we will only build things that we've actually seen a version of. So we're not going to do like theoretical builds. We're not going to be like, let's find out if this enormous thing can work from first principles. They're like, no, it is just a scaled up version of something we have already touched physically with our hands before, right? Now, we get into the 1950s. America has won World War II with the Allies. The Cold War is afoot, and we've entered a whole different world. The world has seen Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And by the time President Dwight D. Eisenhower comes to prominence, he needs to find a silver lining here. What can come of all of this death and destruction? There has to be some positive, right? And that's what nuclear power promises. So he gives his Atoms for Peace speech in 1953, and then the U.S. becomes committed to figuring out how to build nuclear power. And that falls to one guy, Admiral Hyman Rickover. He had built our nuclear submarines, right? So here he was already familiar with the light water technology. He was going to go with that, and he was going to convert that into a civilian thing. Now, to be clear, Rickover almost didn't want this project. He wanted to build a nuclear reactor for carrier vessels, but you have to understand the pressures that Eisenhower was under, right? This is back when Americans actually cared about the federal deficit and the budget and things like that. And they were just like, our budget has gone crazy since the New Deal and World War II, and we need to contain costs. So Eisenhower's like, we're cutting the carrier program, but Rickover as a consolation prize, you can build shipping port. And Rickover's like, I don't really know if this is going to work, but I think we kind of have to do this. And we have to do it for two reasons. One, American corporations will strip this country of all of its natural resources unless we build huge power infrastructure like this that is energy dense. And two, you do it for prestige. You do it for honor. You do it to show that you're the best. And so he turns that around in 2 years. And everybody looks at that and they say, we don't want to buy more nuclear. The big demonstration shipping port tells them, we don't want to buy it. Why? Well, Rickover was so demanding, even though he turned it around in 2 years, that according to the Government Accountability Office, it was actually like the cost overruns were his fault. You know, he was so exacting. Also, they had to stand up like a zirconium industry, which basically didn't exist, you know, all sorts of stuff. He forced Westinghouse to do this, I believe. And, you know, so for the moderator, if I remember correctly, you know, so it cost a ton of money to do this. And he didn't like private industry. He thought those guys sucked. He thought they were lazy. And he thought the private sector could never handle nuclear. He was like, this is not ready for prime time. American corporations are too fat and lazy. They don't have the discipline, and they have to adhere to labor laws that I don't in the Navy. He didn't say that last part, but like, that's kind of what he meant. Now, why did utilities decide to get in the game after a long time? Well, a few reasons. So have you guys seen Oppenheimer?
100% favorite movie.
Okay. Yeah, great movie. Oh, you know Robert Downey Jr.'s character, Admiral Strauss? Right. So
Yes.
he actually plays a huge role here. He's in charge of the Atomic Energy Commission. And he's like, look, we're not going to do a government run thing, right? We're not going to build a nuclear TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. That's our largest public power entities in the South. We're not going to do that because the American people put Eisenhower in office because they want to contain costs, which was true. People were sick of the New Deal by that point. They didn't want to keep doing big projects like that. He was like, this has to be redounded to private industry. So the AEC will help out in financing these things. You know, it will open up this technology to you per the revisions of the Atomic Energy Act. We will do that, but, you know, this has to be a private industry thing. You guys got to do that. So come here and we'll handle the bidding process. And they were like, no. And then Strauss said, bet, then maybe we will do a nuclear TVA and the government will get into the electricity business and just start cranking out nuclear plants. And private industry was just like, shoot, fine, we'll do it. Also, you have to understand the post-war boom was happening, which meant the economy had recovered. It was ripping. You know, there were some small recessions in like 1955, I think, and stuff like that. But overall, the utility industry itself was seeing 7% demand growth on average from like the end of the 40s to the beginning of the 70s, right? So plug that back in. Think back to the build and grow thing. That means you're guaranteed growth, which means you could build bigger and bigger power plants. And actually, it means you need bigger and bigger power plants because growth is ripping so hard. Every public utility commission was like, you got to build something, man. What rate do you want? You tell me, dog. We got to get building here. Otherwise, we're going to have brownouts. And that was true by the 60s. East Coast was starting to see brownouts. The utility industry could not keep up with demand. So they're like, fine, we'll get into the nuclear game. Now that's great for them. It's a new technology. There's all sorts of cool stuff that has come out of World War II, like new alloys from the Air Force for turbines, all of the stuff. The early AutoCAD systems had come out, and they had to build stuff so fast that they abandoned design by experience because they were just like, we can't figure, we just have to like take these huge leaps now. There's nothing we have experience with. And then the other thing is, and this is really, really important to understand, like the boiler efficiencies and growth flatlined, right? So it was the typical S curve, right? So they were just like, so we need to go build way bigger turbines and stuff like that. And we need crazy stuff like atomic fission to figure this bad boy out, right? So all of these things are happening, and they're doing everything they can. They have great engineers, but beneath this, there's a problem, 2 problems, and that is that it used to be, you guys know engineers. Engineers love the hardest problems. They love the sexiest problems. They want the prestige of solving those problems. Good for them, right? So where are you going to go? You're going to go to the industries that give you those problems. Fascinatingly, that stopped being the utility sector around that. Where were they going? Aerospace, the early microelectronics industries. So at the same time, the utility industry was starting to lose its access to top tier talent that was coming out of all of those engineering departments they helped create. They were going to other industries. That creates a huge problem for them. And you have to understand the utility industry was almost completely engineer-led at that time, right? They had like no economics departments. There's one guy who said like, yeah, the easiest job at a utility is being a load growth forecaster because all you need is a ruler and a pencil because it just goes up and to the right. You know,
That's so funny. That's so funny.
yeah, that's all you need, right? So these dynamics are underneath all of this, right? Now, let's put some political color on this, right? Because this is important. All industries, all major industries need, and I know this answer is long, but it's very, very important. All industries need, if they're going to be like this, public license to operate. People have to like it. At first, people are excited about nuclear. Now, one thing that is politically true is that the American people support everything you can think of, just short of taking action. As soon as it starts happening, people start having problems, right? And you have to understand, we're doing like weapons testing and stuff like this at the same time, right? People don't know what the causes of atmospheric radiation are. Nobody's explained this to them. And the AEC has a dual mandate, which is to educate and promote nuclear power and to regulate it. That is a conflict of interest, right? Like that does not make sense, you know? So people can't necessarily feel like they are getting the legit truth. And oftentimes the AEC is not telling them the whole truth because they're like, well, you can't handle the truth. You don't have, you know, scientists and engineers can kind of get like this. This is why you don't put them in charge of comms departments. All due respect. Is because they're just like, well, you're not going to be able to get it. You're not the expert. I'm the expert. So you should just do what I say. You know, the AEC treated people like that a lot. And the Joint Commission on Atomic Energy was a small group of senators in Congress who had access to all of this knowledge. No one else really had any sovereignty over what was going on with nuclear. It's the AEC and the JCAE, which those 2 things, right? The president gave them a very long leash at the AEC. He's like, you figure this out. Like, this is a you thing, baby. Like, you got to put this together, you know, which means that people felt like they weren't being heard. Now, people started to conflate nuclear weapons, often willfully, with civilian nuclear power. There started to become general anxieties about how much power corporate America had, right? Now, there are all sorts of like competing things going on in the world, you know, all sorts of stuff. Back then, you have to understand every single part of your life felt like it was mass manufactured by like 5 corporations. Now, to some extent, that is largely true. They do a better job at disguising that now, but like people didn't like it when it was undisguised. It made them feel weird. It made them feel like they were being controlled, especially because these corporations had such a great relationship with the government, which is what the New Deal had helped to create. So this starts to, and then you get the dawn of the environmental movement, right? Which really starts, in my opinion, with Silent Spring, the book. But also you have to understand what created NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. It was a lawsuit over the Calvert Cliffs, right? NEPA is one of the most pernicious permitting laws that we have, and it came out of this fight over nuclear. Dhruv, you sound like you want to say something, brother. Let it rip.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, like, from what I'm getting is like a lot of nuclear, like when it started to make sense, was that a lot of political pressure and a lot of post-World War II drove this innovations in nuclear. And as now you said, the environmental pressure, it wasn't initially because coal and everything was bad, but primarily that we have to turn this wheel of atomic power in a positive for the community. Which is very interesting.
No, Yeah, absolutely right. Right. So that's a huge part of what's going on. And also, we need economic growth, right? That was a huge part of it. Okay. So we've got all these dynamics. It's getting complicated. How do we start tying all this together? Let's dial in at about the late 60s, right? So this is the rise of the counterculture movement, the rise of the environmental movement. Pretty soon Congress is going to get restructured. So, the JCAE, which sort of protects the Atomic Energy Commission, is just going to get disbanded, right? So all the senators that know everything about nuclear and have been a buffer on this. One of the first agencies to sort of start assaulting the AEC's ability to their sovereignty over siting nuclear power plants is the Fish and Wildlife Commission. If you actually go into the regulatory records, you can still see a lot of U.S. Fish and Wildlife stuff over thermal pollution along waterways. So they want to constrain what the AEC can do. This starts to become an intergovernmental fight. You get all these activists fighting it. You get all this political change. And then the costs of developing reactors starts to go up. You start to see a negative learning curve, right? Well, why does that start to happen? So one thing is, okay, so we've got the talent pipeline problem, right? And then you go from design by experience that we talked about to design by extrapolation. So now they're building plants that they have no experience with, using alloys for turbines, austenitic alloys for these turbines from the Air Force in World War II, that they have no experience using. And then the thing that they were relying on the whole time, which was just make the boiler bigger and more efficient, stops working. It plateaus. And then you have problems with concrete, the size of the plant, what operations are. I mean, this is a new technology. It starts to get very, very confusing, which means people's bills have gone up and the plants haven't come online, which means that the supply is still constrained and everybody starts to get pissed. And then what happens? The Yom Kippur War kicks off, OPEC embargoes oil. Now, the U.S. had all sorts of price controls from the New Deal on expanding more oil drilling and stuff like that, right? Which eventually started to disincentivize people from finding oil and gas, which meant the U.S. didn't have enough domestic supply. And so that just ripped through the economy, right? It's a fossil fuel dependent economy, ripped through it. You have to say something 15, 20% of power generation back then was oil, believe it or not. So that means that costs even went up within the already existing parts of the utility system, and it just flatlined this. And it also led to the destruction of demand growth in the power sector, which means you couldn't finance these plants. The business case for new nuclear disappeared in the 70s, right when costs were going up. So you just started to cancel stuff everywhere. You have all sorts of permitting laws from the environmental movement that are new. You don't know how to navigate them. You have to put up with the public in ways that are annoying and that you're not used to, and that a lot of people did not respond to well. I remember reading one document where some engineer at a public conference this guy was from I think GE. He was just well, we should just start cutting the power until the public admits that we need fast reactors, which is an insane comm strategy to debut at a conference,
Just
not the
deprive them of
wisest.
power.
Yeah.
Deprive them of power.
And then they'll understand how good and important we are, right? And they'll do whatever we say. And then, a few other things happen. The AEC becomes the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, at first, is almost a pernicious actor. Plants are getting ripped apart while they're being built to meet new standards. It is, look, if you need a development process to be more efficient, you really need a stable environment to do that, right? Think about it this way. If you're going to run a factory, you're not going to run it in the open air. You're going to put a roof over it and put it in a building. All of the social license, the financing, the engineering pipeline, the regulatory structure, those are the house. That's the building that sits over the process of developing nuclear power, right? It contains it so it's stable. All those things became unstable at once and the business case disappeared. So we stopped building it. We just stopped doing it, right? Between, the mid-1970s and now, we've only built, we finished Watts Bar. That's a little bit different. But we only built Vogtle 3 and 4, and that cost $35 billion, right? And it was delayed, in part because you had to refinance a whole new workforce, a whole new supply chain, all new everything. The design wasn't finished, which is tough. That's tough. It's tough you're we're about halfway done. And then you're partway through and you're actually, we were 5% done.
Goes against the build by experience
Yeah,
idea.
exactly. Right. Yeah. Or even, design by extrapolation itself, because the design isn't finished. Right. So there's a lot of learning you got to do on the ground. That's again, unstable environment. By the way, Vogel also got hit with some of the insane environmental laws, right? They wanted to dredge parts of the Savannah River so they could float modules up it to put at the plant. That was like a 3-year process that cost millions and millions of dollars of permitting litigation. And eventually the permitting litigation became so expensive, they were just like, all right, fine, we're just going to put a foundry on site and do it there. We're not going to do this modular float-in stuff. Never mind. We're not going to do it. So that's a picture of what became difficult about nuclear power. What's different now is, so back in the era we're talking about, right? The 60s and 70s, when you're starting to see the negative learning curve. My buddy Nick Turan was at the Library of Congress the other day, actually looking at old documents from this era. And you start to see them float the idea of SMRs. They're like, maybe what we need to do for cost containment is make these smaller and sacrifice some of the neutron economy, right? To just be able to stamp them out quicker. Maybe that's the way forward. And now we're in a world where we're trying to see if that's correct, right? Where the Trump administration still wants to build some big boys. President's executive order wants 10 more of those, basically 10 more gigawatt scale guys that we already have approved designs for. So that would probably be the AP1000, but could also be, what is it? The Korean one. And then is it KPR? I can't remember. And then there's the ABWR from GE Hitachi, right? So something just came out this morning when we're recording. So this is Friday, March 13th. Alex Kaufman over at Canary Media wrote a piece about how the Trump administration is actually in talks with the Japanese and the Koreans about maybe bringing those designs in because Westinghouse and Brookfield are being difficult. So, that's what's going on there, right? We're in a new era. And one of the reasons why anybody's thinking about nuclear right now isn't because of climate change or anything like that. It isn't because they think nuclear is sick, which it is.
Yeah.
It is because demand growth is back.
Demand growth.
And they need a way to meet that, right? And nuclear is a great way to try and meet that. The question is whether or not we can deploy quickly. And this is a very hard industry to get right. You guys have all these young engineers. They know it's difficult. It is demanding. That's the appeal, right? As we talked about earlier, conquering these big projects. So I'm going to shut up now. I'm sure you guys have other questions. That was a very
100%.
long...
No, but then it was a well-structured answer. Lot to learn from what you said. It's a very good history lesson on nuclear. And I'll accept that it's a very tough industry. And to be honest, like one of the goal is to educate young people to get into this industry because I don't think we have a lot of people.
Okay. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I was looking at some data. This is all provisional, right? Yeah. This is something that I've intuited from reading old utility trade publications because I'm a really cool and popular guy who does that on his weekends. And, looking at them and they're talking about the talent crisis, right? So what you see is actually in the nuclear sphere of that, this weird valley of death, right? Where between your generation, NX, whatever, and then the boomers, it goes like this. It looks like a camel's hump. It's like bunch of people in nuclear, no people in nuclear, bunch more people in nuclear now, which means that this whole mid-career thing that would pass off knowledge to your generation is really thin, right? Which means we really need young people to come into this. And we need them to come into the building and trades as well. We need everybody to start thinking about this because this stuff is going to touch more than just nuclear. It's going to touch everything.
And this conversation needs to happen in every level because people just don't understand how important it is. So you talked about that chart, when everything was down, more people in nuclear, the young generation didn't look towards that industry.
Yes.
They're just focused on some other. But yeah, we'll get to more of these questions and SMRs. I think next question that I had was about Samuel Insull. You mentioned about him.
Yeah.
Some people are unfamiliar about Samuel and the utility model. So the question about what did his ideas change about monopoly utilities and regulated returns, and how did that institutional model later enable nuclear at scale?
Great. Okay. So I've already touched on a little bit of that, and now we can dial in some of that prehistory a little bit more. So glad you asked. Samuel Insull is, I think, an unsung hero of American history. He was born in the UK. He comes over here to work for Thomas Edison as a young man in the late 19th century, learns everything that he can, eventually takes over a lot of, he gets, Edison's power of attorney as a young man at one point. That's how important he becomes to Thomas Edison. Now, the creation of General Electric happened because Edison got bought out and kicked out of the electricity industry. Because I'm going to be completely honest with you, Edison was a bad businessman, and he made the wrong physics bet. Edison thought that direct current was the way to go, right? That's what he was going to do. You build a bunch of small power plants close to their source, And that's how you do it. George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla were like, I think you build one big plant and then send that stuff as fast as possible on AC and then step it down to wherever it needs to be. And you unlock economies of scale and efficiency there. Well, they just ended up winning out on that. So Edison gets bought out, and Insull's next in line to take over what becomes General Electric, or could be, and he just doesn't want to do it. He doesn't like how his mentor got dealt with by JP Morgan, et cetera, et cetera. And so he said, I'm going to become president of Chicago Edison, which was one of Edison's old utilities here, where I am right now in Chicago. And everybody thought he was an idiot, because Chicago was kind of a backwater back then. It was a boom town, right? There was a lot of, if you go to, I'm sure certain cities in China, or India or something like that, you get these cities that are just like exploding with population overnight because so much industry is being injected there, right? And it's kind of chaotic and messy and weird. I was Chicago, like that's what it was. It wasn't New York, right? And so people looked down on it, but he took a bet. He said, I think it won't be creating the manufacturing elements for nuclear, or not for nuclear, for electricity that will determine the business. It will be selling power itself. And that's what I want to do. So I'm going to take over Commonwealth Edison, or I'm going to take over ComEd, right? That's eventually what it becomes. And he buys out everyone in Chicago, right? Starting from the Loop, which is downtown. He buys out all the other DC firms, consolidates it, rationalizes the trains, runs them on electricity, which was the drivetrain for that was developed at Sargent and Lundy, which still exists in Chicago and has worked on like every nuclear power project in this country, right? They're still in the Loop where they were. Every drivetrain, I think almost over the entire world, uses that patent to this day, right? To run those trains. So he starts doing all of that. And then he starts to realize like, hey, wait a second. What I need here are economies of scale. And to get those economies of scale, I need the financing. And that's when he starts saying, we need to regulate this industry so that we can stabilize it, because otherwise we're going to keep getting into rate wars and sending each other into bankruptcy. And again, I brought up, you're going to have redundant infrastructure, power lines you don't need, and you're not going to be able to have one large plant that serves a bunch of people. You're going to have a bunch of smaller plants that aren't necessarily as efficient doing it, which means the price of power is going to be higher than it needs to be, right? So Insull was a guy who basically created that regulatory compact, right? That was his Zeus born from his head and made it a reality. And he set the whole, everything we talked about, all of the investment cycle, like all of that stuff that the utility industry was doing when nuclear came onto the scene, he had pioneered decades before that, right? So the business conditions that he thought of around the turn of the century were true for the utility industry for almost an entire century, which is an incredible legacy. He ended up being disgraced around the New Deal era. His brother picked a fight with FDR. Pro tip, don't do that. And so when FDR became president, he was just like, I'm gunning for Insull. And Insull had sold a lot of watered stock to people because everybody just thought utilities were going to go up forever, and it didn't. And so then a lot of normal people lost a lot of money. When the stock market crash happened, that was true everywhere. And he was never found guilty of defrauding people, in part because he went bankrupt trying to make his own investors whole. He died alone at a train station in Paris with nothing in his pockets. Somebody had picked through his pockets when he died, and that's what happened to him. So I think we owe him a lot.
Great story.
It's a quite sad ending for
Yeah.
And so, but to tie in back to the regulatory framework and so on, looking back, what 2-3 conditions that mattered the most to make nuclear buildable? For example, monopoly utilities, rate-based cost recovery, cheap capital, long planning horizons, or stable demands. And if you had to rank them, which one would come first or outweigh?
God, that's a great question. I was actually just thinking about that the other day. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I was committing self-harm yesterday. I was looking into nuclear NQA1 standards and the supplier pool for those versus ISO 9001. And I was giving myself a headache. And I was thinking about this very question. What's most important here? Does fixing things like this really, really matter so that you can manage a project correctly, right? That's another type of stability, right, that we can think about. In other words, is this a regulatory issue? Is this a financing issue? What is it? This is a question I ask myself every 2 weeks. As I'm just like, oh, I think it's got to be the financing. Then I'm like, oh, maybe I'm wrong.
Then
But
change back in a
generally,
month.
yeah, exactly. So I think really two things I think that I ended up coming back to that I think are really, really important no matter what. And I think the demand signal has to be there because there has to be a business case for building nuclear. So in my mind, that's number one. And then the second thing that has to be there is financing. You have to be able to finance these plants. There's a lot of sticker shock from Vogtle 3 and 4 still. People are freaked out about that. A lot of utilities don't want to go to their PUC. They don't have the balance sheets that Southern has. Right? Southern's balance sheets, for people who don't know, they're the utility company that commissioned Vogtle 3 and 4, right? Their balance sheets are like bigger than all of Kentucky, like that whole customer pool, right? Like that's how big Southern is as a utility. It has been there forever too. It's one of the oldest utilities in America. Oh, not everybody has that. So they don't want to go to their public service commission, their public utility commission and be like, we kind of need to do a rate hike. Also, we want to build a nuclear power plant. They're going to be like, absolutely not. Sorry. So we need things like the Loans Program Office or the Energy Dominance Financing Office in the DOE, which does have the ability to do this. I think we'll see some loans roll out this year. So I think that needs to be there because you have to be able to pay for this stuff, right? So you have to have a reason to buy it. You need to be able to pay for it. And the third thing is, and this is the thing we're struggling with now, is you have to have experience building it. And that's a chicken and egg problem, right? Which sort of the first two things kind of help you solve, right? If there's enough of a business case and you have the financing, you can go ahead and get the experience. Now, the experience might be painful and you might hate it, but you're going to need it, right? That's what we want. We want economies of repetition here. So that when I look at it, it's that way. Obviously, you don't want a lot of regulatory changes, but I would say that those elements can overcome a difficult regulatory threshold to deploy nuclear because you have enough stability on that end, so long as you don't get more regulatory chaos. Could fixing the regulatory regime help? Like, could, dealing with some NEPA stuff help nuclear? Totally. Absolutely. Could putting in a firm dose rate instead of having a LARA as low as reasonably achievable help? Yeah, I think mostly in operations and things like that, but sure, why not? That's good on the merits, right? Could fixing, quote unquote, fixing or adjusting NQA1 standards or using AI to do all that paperwork for them drive down costs? I think absolutely yes. But I think you could successfully deliver a project on increased demand, good financing alone.
I just
Absolutely.
wanted,
Yeah. Go ahead, Dhruv.
I just wanted to add, not add, but to mention, like, now that you mentioned like demand has to be at the top of this chain, but going back to our previous conversation about like the start of World War and how nuclear had to be started not on just the demand of energy, but on the demand of like public affirmation of this technology that we have now developed. So kind of justifying why have we worked on this. It helps you as well. It's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that you got to understand that like nuclear was in a different position than any other technology because it had been fully created by the government. There is no other than maybe like the internet, and that's like half and half to some degree, that has been lock, stock, and barrel completely innovated by the US government. So that was actually a real puzzle for the US to solve. How do we devolve this to private hands? And how do we do that in the middle of a Cold War where nuclear technology is an edge that the US has over its peer competitor in the Soviet Union? Right? That's the whole dance that had to be done. That's a very difficult problem, right? It's easy to look back and judge people for decisions they made back then, but the more you contextualize it, that doesn't mean that they were right, but you can understand why they were making the decisions they were making.
Very interesting.
Yeah, 100%. Like, it's so good to learn. We also wanted to learn about the Texas story, but the Texas famously stayed largely separate from the Eastern and Western interconnections. And what was the original motivation for that choice? We'd like to know about that. And what does it tell us about how grid institutions shape what kinds of power plants are easier or harder to build?
Yeah, totally. So look, I'm not exactly sure why Texas decided to do that. I would be willing to bet that it's because Texas is Texas and they like running their own thing, and they always have. It's the Lone Star Republic, right? They like being in control. And largely, I think it was to avoid having to put up with the federal regulator. Like, right? So FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has no jurisdiction in Texas. Texas does its own thing, right? And that becomes really important when Texas converts from being a traditional utility thing and this happened in the 90s. A bunch of regions and states opened up to becoming power markets rather than traditional utilities. Some of those utilities still exist there. It gets very complex and weird. But what you have to know is they basically turned it into a wholesale market like you would for like an oil spot market or a gas spot market. They were like, we could do that for electricity. And Texas did that. And, can't say boo about how they run that. And Texas likes it that way. So it means that they don't, for example, export their power and they don't import power, right? They are fully self-contained. Now, Texas is also like the energy capital of America. So like not everybody can do what Texas is doing. That's their thing. Now, here's the major question, right? And this is true in Texas and this is true in other regions, right? So like 60% of the country is in these power markets, right? And we have not yet seen a new nuclear project ever financed and finished in a power market in America. We haven't seen it. Now, to be fair, we also have never seen demand growth happen in one of these power markets in a serious way, right? That's why the interconnections got so long for these power markets over the last year. They were just like, when we were created, demand growth was flat. That's all we know how to do. We don't know how to do this. They've done it. A lot of them are trying their best to learn. It's very hard to govern these institutions. They're difficult. Power system's complicated. It's made more complicated by its markets, in my opinion. That is the painful position that they're in. Now, Texas has some advantages in that its permitting laws are really, really conducive to building new infrastructure overall. It has a lot of energy talent there, right? So one of the things that you see the Trump administration doing right now is the DOE put out a request for information, or RFI, for these nuclear life cycle innovation campuses, basically little nuclear Shenzhens. And if you don't know what that means, those are the special economic zones in China. Shenzhen is a special economic zone right across the way from Hong Kong. And that is where a lot of the manufacturing is. Right? They create this little zone where all of these manufacturers are together and you start to have network effects that are like social and intellectual between all these like engineers and business owners who are trying to do that. Right? They're trying to do that with these life cycle campuses. The reason I bring that up is like you could see for oil and gas, Texas is basically one big version of those, right? You get all the majors out there, you get all the wildcatters out there, you get everybody out there working on energy. It's a very impressive place. I love Texas, love the Permian Basin. I've been there many times. It's so sick.
So like an energy hub. Sorry.
Yeah, it's an energy hub, right? So you got a lot of knowledge there. And you also have, I think, a few SMR companies there. Allo Atomics is there, along with a few others. And then you have Fermi America, which wants to build 4 AP1000s for a data center project, which is, let rip. Good luck. That seems awesome and crazy at the same time, and I'm here for it. I want it to happen for them. I hope they're successful. And in part, they feel like they can do that because Texas has such good permitting laws. Now, whether or not the Texas market can actually bear assets like nuclear, right, which don't necessarily perform well in a spot market because wind and solar backstopped by a ton of natural gas do better with the fluctuations of a market, right? You want nuclear so that you can just like run it all the time as much as possible to get your money's worth out of it, right? That's what you want. However, we know that nuclear can load follow, right? In other words, do the same thing natural gas does for wind and solar because it does that in France, right? So nuclear load follows in France. So we know that that's technically possible for nuclear. I just think it's not optimal for nuclear. And that creates issues in this market, especially if we're going to flood wind and solar with a bunch of subsidies that distort the price signal, which is what we've done before. And that has actually forced a lot of nuclear and especially coal off the grid. So we had some nuclear plants closed down at the dawn of the power market era in the early 2000s because of this. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I'm rooting for Texas. I'm always rooting for Texas because I love Texas. I would love for us to figure out how to solve the financing and successfully operating a nuclear plant in a power market. I would love us to figure out if that's fully possible. What you have to understand now is this is the beginning. Everything we're talking about here is the beginning of the nuclear renaissance. And here's the story about any renaissance, including the Renaissance. It's honestly a horrible time. It is awesome to look back on, because greatness is achieved. It is brutal to live through.
I think this gives us a good segue into the next question that we have. In your writing, and correct me if I'm wrong, you framed the decline of U.S. nuclear energy as an institutional breakdown and not a technical one. What changed in the system that turned nuclear power from buildable to not buildable?
Yeah, totally. So, I think, we got pretty good at designing plants and having reactor types that were successful. We might have built too many reactor types, which kept us from learning. That's another thing I actually didn't bring up, is we just built a ton of different reactor designs, which meant we didn't really learn one to another. They were all within the light water, for the most part, family, but Each one's different. So the institutional failure is interesting, right? So it's sort of like we lose a lot of the utility model nationwide as we understand it, which means we lose a traditional financing mechanism in a growth period for that. Because we specialize not in industrial policy for engineers and workers and tradesmen, we do industrial policy for lawyers, which means we do a lot of litigation, right? And so I was looking the other day, I was like, how long are the permitting timelines in San Francisco County for like a project? What's the median? The median is 412 days for your permitting. You're paying for the land, your loans, all those carrying costs at the same time.
Crazy.
I mean, yeah, crazy, right? Let's take a look at what happened to Micron, right? I don't know if you guys saw this data center in New York. New York says, hey, Micron, we want you to come here. We're going to put you through like we're going to put you through like 300 something days of permitting, And Micron says, fine, we'll do it. It's almost a year of permitting. They're like, we'll do it. And then a California environmental group goes around that community where Micron is building that, finds 6 people to sue them and say, you didn't permit hard enough. You need to do more permitting. Right? This is an institutional failure. This is huge institutional failure. One thing that I want engineers to understand, and this is to all the young engineers out there, I want to say what you are doing is so important because what you have to understand about technology is that it is not tools, it is you. It is you. Technology is people. It is the process knowledge that they have. It is the community of building that they form together. We can build anything. We can figure that out. The tools don't matter if the minds and hands don't know how to use them, right? That's what's so important about what every young engineer that listens to this is doing. You are doing God's work, in my opinion. We need more of you. Please, we need more of you for everything.
Yes.
We need to stop encouraging a world where we disincentivize building because we sacrifice our ability to enter into the knowledge ecosystem of building when we do this. This is the primary, in my mind, institutional failure. One of the things that you have to understand is when we start offshoring to China, one of the reasons that we do that is because it's regulatory arbitrage, right? Is we say, who wants to put up with these permitting timelines? Who wants to do this? I could just go to Shenzhen, get a bunch of people to work for like $0.01 an hour and crank these suckers out. And like, that's what I want to do because I want to build, right? If you want a good book, you can check out that goes into some of that. You can check out Patrick McGee's Apple in China. I would also recommend Barry C. Lynn's End of the Line, which was written in 2005 and was about the dangers of global supply chains and offshoring and what it does to institutional knowledge for building. It's about a lot of other stuff too, but I read that book during COVID. That guy was like 15 years early on that stuff, right? And it's only like 200 something pages. It's a fun read. I don't agree with everything in it, but it's very eye-opening, right? And then the other one I'll read
that, those books.
Yeah, and then the other one that I'll recommend that I'm reading right now, which I think is great. I think a lot of engineers will already know what's going on in it. But for me, it's been very, very eye-opening, is Brian Potter's The Origins of Efficiency, which came out last year from Stripe Press. I'm writing a review for American Affairs. I've been very impressed with that book. It's also a beautiful book. Every time I hold it, I'm like, God, it's so beautiful. So yeah, let's talk about SMRs for a second, right? We have a lot of these new companies. Most of them are going to fail. Going to be honest with you, because most businesses fail. That's just the rule. I don't make the rules. That's just life.
Are you willing to bet on like one company that might?
No, I'm not. But I think we're getting close to a place where we will figure out who the top dog is going to be. And that's in part because of the pilot program that the DOE is doing and because there's just so much excitement. And there are business cases for SMRs. And the business case is this, right? You just have places that don't need a gigawatt. You have customers that don't need a gigawatt scale nuclear plant. Right? Now, SMR maximalists are going to say, and to reference our earlier part of our conversation, we can rep these out fast enough that we can get the economies of repetition, which means we can build more of them per place, per plant, and make up for the fact that we don't have the full gigawatt scale. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I'm not sure if those efficiencies actually work out. However, I do believe that there are customers that are going to want SMRs and that they will have a place in our market. And people are taking those bets right now. So we are not yet at the time where we can settle up. People have crazy timelines for some of these deployments, man. Like, I look at it and I'm like, bro, no way. I would be amazed if anybody goes commercial before or even by 2030.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's just not, I'm sorry, like that.
So in that kind of aspect, like, what part do you think of this SMR story are like realistic from like buildability standpoint?
Yeah. So I personally think that you're an advantage if you're in the light water family for SMR because you're trading on most of our existing regulation and our existing supply chains, which I think gives you an advantage. Whether or not we should have done light water, this is a whole debate nuclear engineers love to relitigate with themselves every 2 to 5 years, where they're like, Rickover is a monster because he crushed whatever sodium reactor I think is the best, or what have you. Or no, Rickover's a god because he made the right bet for light water and that determined the global fleet mostly, whatever. The difference between should and is here is really important. It just is true that we are path dependent for light water. So I think that those SMRs have an advantage. Whether or not you think they should is another question, right? It's just, I think, the case. And, I think what we are getting is we are getting a nuclear program of intense learning by doing through this pilot program and all of this stuff without having to sacrifice a lot of taxpayer money to do it. And I think that's good.
Yeah.
I think that is good.
Yeah.
Right. So I like that the companies are doing this. I think it is cool that they are doing this. I hope we can figure out a pathway from these test demonstrations that the DOE wants towards getting approved by the NRC, because I think it would be cool to have a pathway that involves proving something to some degree before you go and do it. I think that's important. I think that's sick, right? So I hope that happens. For my money, I think that the easiest lever to pull is still large light water. Now, what's going to matter is whether or not these incumbents can play ball. Do they want to build? Do they want to get into it, right? All due respect to GE, they're like, SMR makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
Right? Right, because it's what? It is 80% of the throughput for the ABWR, right? But then 70% less capacity. I'm sorry. And I'm not a smart guy, right? When it comes to this type of stuff, I'm a humanities guy. I look at that and I'm like, who's going to buy that? That's really what's going to determine some of these SMR economics. Is whether or not the concrete pours for the foundation can actually get radically smaller for these guys.
Yeah.
Right? It's stuff like that. It's going to be and we're in the early finding out stage. And some of the oldest companies like NewScale don't even have a deal on the table. I don't know what the hell those guys are doing. So, and that's not to say that nobody's going to succeed. I think someone will succeed and I want them to succeed. I think it is good for America if they succeed. Again, this goes back to the thing I said earlier. We are at the beginning.
Yeah, we are at the beginning of, I think we are again in 1960s, 1970s. It's just a new renaissance.
Brother, we aren't even there. We aren't even there.
Not even there. Yeah.
No, we're in 1957.
It's totally a new start. And that's where, go ahead.
We're in 1957 all over again, right? So it's you build shipping port, and you finish Vogtle. And people are I don't want another. You're I don't want another one of those.
Yeah.
The utility industry wasn't oh, sick. I want Rickover to make this possible and to also go over budget. Awesome.
Yeah. And with that,
sign me up, brother.
Yeah. And with that, I'll come to my last question. So we are back to 1957. And we have one history to learn from 1960s, 1970s. And now we are starting again. So what would you advise to utility or policymaker today based on those learnings? One lesson. Yeah. One lesson? Oh, this is such a good question because, look, there are a lot of things that I can say are technical policy questions. Let's say no. Let's put those all to one side. Here's what matters most. Right? This is a Winston Churchill line. What matters now is courage. That is the primary virtue because it is the one that makes all the others possible, right? To do this, we need courage. It is going to be hard. All the young engineers out there who are listening to this, the world needs your courage. The United States of America needs your courage. Policymakers, it needs your courage. I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. Today is the time for valiance. Today is the time where we ride out and see what's what. And we need shared courage to do this. That is my advice. And courage isn't just a feeling. It's not, I'm willing to take the risk, right? It's, I'm willing to sit in the saddle when the riding gets hard, when this gets scary. That's what we need. That's the best advice you can give. So, Dhruv, we should be courageous and that we should pass this information to all young people. But thank you so much, Emmet. This was amazing. I think people would learn a lot from this about history. I'm so happy to be here, guys. Well, thank you so much for everything you're doing. And thank you so much. And stick with it.
Thank you so much. This is just the motivation I needed as I graduate in April.
Good.
Thank you so much.
All good. Thank you so much. Have a nice rest of the week. Emmet, take care.
Thank you.